children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not.
Even as a hen gathers her chicken under her wings, and you would not. Jesus was telling the Hebrews that I wanted to often gather you and protect you. Doesn't mean to have somebody under the wings. How often I want to do it, but you wouldn't let me. Why? Because of your wickedness. But watch what he says in the next verse. Go ahead.
Behold, your house is left unto you desolate.
Now this is very important. He said, behold, your house, Jerusalem, is left unto you desolate. What was the house in Jerusalem? The temple of God. He said, your temple is left unto you desolate. He's letting you know that all of this relates to the destruction of the temple. Now go on into Matthew 24 and pick it up in verse 1 and read.
And Jesus went out and departed from the temple.
Because that's where they were. They were in the temple. Go ahead.
And his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down.
So Jesus' disciples were showing him this temple. And he told them, Truly I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone of the temple that shall not be thrown down. He's telling his disciples, this temple is going to be destroyed one day. Go ahead and read.
And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be?
Now he said, when shall these things be? What things? The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. This is what it pertains to. We'll read the next part.
And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?
And see, this is where people assume that this is talking about the second coming of the Messiah and the end of the world that comes with. But we're going to show you something. Let's go over to Mark 13 and verse 3 and read the exact same thing, but a parallel account of it. Mark chapter 13 and verse 3. Because it seems like in Matthew 24 they asked him 3 questions concerning the destruction of the temple, the sign of his so-called second coming, and the end of the world. But watch how this is worded in Mark. Mark 13 and 3. Read when you get there.
And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately.
Now notice it's giving you a little bit more detail. It's telling you who the disciples were, particularly, exactly the location of the Mount of Olives in association with the temple. But go ahead and read.
Tell us, when shall these things be?
Now this is the same question, but watch how this differs from Matthew 24. Go ahead.
And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?
Did you notice that 2 elements are missing that was in Matthew 24? What happened to the sign of your coming and the end of the world in Mark 13? Notice in Mark 13, it seems like the only thing the disciples are concerned with is the destruction of the temple and the signs that are going to lead up to the destruction of the temple. Well, let's read this again in Luke chapter 21 and verse 5. Because if you read Mark, it seems like they're not even concerned with the end of the world or the second coming. Which, if you ask me, that would be the most important thing of the discourse. The end of the world, surely that's more important than the destruction of the temple. And, the coming of Jesus, that's important too, right? But Luke 21 and verse 5. Luke 21 and 5. You have to understand that the Gospels are saying the same thing, just in different ways. 21 and 5. Read.
And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down.
And we read it in Matthew 24, and we just read it in Mark 13. But keep reading.
And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be?
They said, when shall these things be? What? The destruction of the temple. Go ahead.
And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass?
Notice that Luke did the same thing that Mark did. Why is it that Mark and Luke don't mention the end of the world and the coming of the Son of Man? Only thing they mention is the destruction of the temple and the signs that are going to lead up to the destruction of the temple. Remember, all of the Gospels are saying the same thing, in different ways. So if that is the case, we must conclude that when Matthew 24 said the sign of your coming and the end of the world, it meant the same thing Luke and Mark meant, which is what? The destruction of the temple and the signs that lead up to the destruction of the temple. But somebody might still argue, well, wait a minute, Matthew 24 may just got extra information in it. Maybe Matthew 24 knew something that Luke 21 and Mark 13 doesn't. They said the sign of your coming and the end of the world. We're going to show you something. Let's go back to Matthew 24 and pick it up in verse 3. And I want you to read that again. We're going to show you about something about how that word world is used in the New Testament. Matthew 24 and pick it up in verse 3. Go ahead and read.
And he sat upon the Mount of Olives. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be?
Now we already know that these things are the destruction of the temple. But go ahead and read.
And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?
It says the sign of your coming and the end of the world, which when you parallel it with Mark and Luke, it says the sign that these things don't come to pass. Which means the sign of his coming must relate to the sign that these things are going to come to pass. But we're going to look at that a little later. But it says the end of the world. What should be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? First, let's look up the word translated world in this verse. 165 in the Greek section. The word translated world. Because when people read this, they're thinking it's the end of the world as we know it in our time or in the near future. In other words, things as we see it are not going to be that way anymore. But we're going to show you that is not what they were asking him. 165 in the Greek, the word translated world, what is it?
Aeon.
Aeon. And what does it mean?
An age.
An age. That word there should actually be translated age. They were asking him, what shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Because the disciples understood that the age was coming to an end. We're going to see later on what age they were talking about in particular. But it said they wanted to know about the end of the age. They were not talking about the world as we know it, in their time or our time. If they were talking about the world as we know it, they were talking about the Hebrew world. That was coming to an end. The Hebrew world as they knew it, with temples and sacrifices and high priests. That's what was coming to an end. But finish reading the definition.
By extension, perpetuity. Also past.
Also past. A past age. Go ahead.
By application, the world.
By implication, the world. By implied, the world. But in what sense?
Specifically
what?
Jewish.
A Jewish age. The Jewish age ended when? In 70 AD. Because that's when their temple was destroyed. And we're going to see that. And that's what Matthew 24 is talking about entirely. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Nothing in our time or the future. But we're going to show you that. Go ahead.
A messianic period.
A messianic period. That means a period or time era dealing with the Messiah. When will that come to an end? But go ahead and read.
Present or future.
Present or future. And we know it's going to be talking about the past to us from what we're going to read. It was future to them, but it's past to us because it's already been fulfilled. Go ahead.
Age. Course.
Like a course in history. Go ahead.
Eternal. For or forever. Or forevermore. In lever. Beginning of the.
The beginning of the end of the age. What shall be the sign that this stuff is beginning and end? We'll go ahead and read.
Or while the world began without end.
Begin without end. That's good. So the point is, that word there is talking about the word age. A specific time period. What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Not the world as we know it. But we know some people going to still argue. It still could mean the end of the world as we know it in our future time. But let me show you something about the Bible. Something called Bible language. And when I say Bible language, I don't mean Hebrew. I don't mean Aramaic. I don't mean Greek. I mean Bible terminology. Because if you don't understand Bible terminology and you're thinking with this Western civilization way of thinking, you're going to read something in the Bible that